The Arithmetic of a Wise Heart. Today we look at a very unique psalm, Psalm 90. It's unique because it's the only psalm attributed to Moses, and it connects with him at the end of his life, 120 years old, standing on Mount Pisgah and looking towards the promised land. And this psalm starts and ends with God, the sovereign and eternal God, who's the only answer for us humans, whose lives can be summed up by the psalmist in two words: brief and grief. Life is brief. The length of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have the strength. And not much has changed in that time since Moses wrote those words so many centuries ago. I think statistics, New Zealand tells us that the average life expectancy for men is about 80 and for women a few years older. Mind you, when I think of what my grandfather was in his 70s and how I am now, I think almost us folk in our 70s feel probably that in our 80s will be more like our grandparents. About a number of years ago, I explored Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life. And in it he says this: one of the biggest ways you can waste your life is thinking all there is here and now. You're going to spend far more time on that side of death than you do on this side. On this side, you may get to live to 60, 70, 80 or 90 years or so, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to eternity. The time you spend on earth really isn't that very long. It's like if you stretched out a line from Tokyo to Los Angeles across the Pacific Ocean. The first millimeter of that line would not even equal how tiny your life is compared to all the time you're going to spend in eternity. You are made for eternity, and life is preparation for eternity. And what Moses gets us to do in this psalm is to have a good look at how brief our life is and how best we deal with that. And he gives some images to show us the brevity of life. First is that of dust. You turn men back to dust, saying, "Return to dust, O sons of men." You may have heard the story of a little girl who learned in Sunday school that man came from dust and eventually returns to dust. She looked under her bed one morning and said, "Mother, Mother, come. There's somebody under my bed, but I don't know whether he's coming or going." That's a child's way of underscoring this great truth. God sets limits to life. We come from the dust and return to the dust. And the second image is that of a dream. You sweep people away like dreams that disappear, the New Living Translation puts it. And a third image is what I call, with a bit of poetic license, dandelions. It's actually desert grass, or like grass that springs up in the morning. In the morning it blooms and flourishes, but by evening it is dry and withered. Now Moses in this psalm seems to get quite morbid. He's preoccupied with time. In fact, units of time, morning, evening, night, day, years, are referred to 15 times in these verses. And Moses reminds us that for each of our lives, the clock is ticking and the hourglass of life is running down. To make it worse, Moses also makes a number of statements about our lives being full of trouble and grief. And he says the length of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have the strength. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. Life has grief. Our lives are shot through with experiences of trouble, sorrow, and disappointment. Now, in one way, we can accuse Moses, and you can accuse me if you like, since I'm talking about this, as being depressing. But in another sense, you can argue we are being realistic. And I guess for all of this year, in a most unusual year of our lives, we've faced with the impact of the coronavirus and how that has not only made some people's life more brief, but has also created a huge amount of grief in our world. And Moses in Psalm 90, in the light of life being brief and splattered with grief, approaches God with a prayer. And this is how the New International Version puts verse 12. Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Or the New Living Translation, teach us to make the most of our time, so that we may grow in wisdom. I guess the New Testament equivalent is provided by Paul in Ephesians 5. Be very careful in how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. I think the King James Version puts it, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. And this is the key challenge of the psalm. How do you and I gain a heart of wisdom? Or how do we number our days aright? How do you and I do the arithmetic of a wise heart? And can I suggest that in the psalm, Moses gives a threefold answer about doing a reality check. Firstly, we recognize the reality of death. We do live for a finite time, most of us well into our old age. Some tragically are cut short early on. Others slip away after a period of illness. Sadly, as part of our election process in New Zealand at the moment, there's a referendum on end of life, and I'm quite concerned about that. But the statistics do indicate that 100% of people die. Death is a reality. Secondly, we recognize the reality of God. In fact, can I suggest it is only a relationship with the eternal God that underscores both the brief and grief aspect of life with some meaning, and then provides us with a genuine alternative. Moses affirms that God is our constant help and our only hope. He opens the psalm with this majestic affirmation about God when he states that God is our home. O Lord, you've always been our home. And the opening hymn in the service today, taken from the psalm, had as its first verse, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. So Psalm 90 refers to several features of God. God's eternity, which is the total contrast and answer to our own brevity. And then God's wrath or anger. And this is a really uncomfortable reality. I wonder whether it's the reason that the lectionary reading actually omits verses 7 to 12 in the psalm, which all refer to God's anger and wrath, 5 times in fact. And the idea of God's wrath takes us back to Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve disobey God's command. And God's wrath, his righteous anger, is all connected to human sin and rebellion. God's wrath is real. However, while God cannot condone our rebellion because of his great love, he cannot leave us stuck in it. And so the psalmist says, satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love. So how do we cope with the reality of both God's wrath and God's love? Let me illustrate. I have a cousin living in Cambridge up in the North Island who turned 91 2 weeks ago. The week before his birthday, he went into hospital to have 14 skin cancers removed. One was particularly bad, the one that was on his leg, and required a major skin graft. The surgeon who operated had his anger directed against the cancers, but his care, his deep personal care, was for my cousin and his well-being. Can I suggest that God's anger is directed against the cancer of sin in our lives and in our world, because he knows how destructive it is. But his love caused Jesus to come and deal with it in an amazing way. So the heart of wisdom engages with God and cries out, turn, O Lord, how long? Have compassion on your servants. And as we engage with God, we also engage with the third part of our reality check. We recognize the reality of life. The psalmist has several key aspects of life that he talks about in the final verses of the psalm. And I like the Message translation of verse 12. Oh, teach us to live well, teach us to live wisely and well. And as part of living wisely and well, I think the psalmist suggests we do another form of arithmetic. We count our blessings. Moses engages with blessings that mean we live wisely and well. Verses 14 to 17, satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you've afflicted us, for as many years as we've seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. The blessings that I see in these verses are those of gladness, involvement of our children, and success of our efforts. What I would label laughter and legacy. Do you want to live wisely and well? Then laugh a lot. Do you think God laughs? Of course he does. Where does our sense of humor come from? Decades ago, people thought it was wrong to be light-hearted in church. Church was deadly serious stuff. You shouldn't be smiling here. No, I think that's rubbish. I know that the Bible concept of joy is far deeper and stronger than happiness and humor. Yet I know also that humor, good humor, is an important part of our humanity. And what about legacy? Moses suggests two strands of this, our family and our work. The opening verse of the psalm said, Lord, you've been our dwelling place throughout all generations. And then Moses prays for something more specific, much more specific. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. This is an amazing request. We moderns are inclined to see life out of focus. We seldom think of ourselves as being part of a bundle of life which goes back to the very beginning, unless you're into researching your family tree or have had your DNA tested for that very reason. And there is something in human life that persists from one generation to another. I am blessed because both my great-grandfather on my dad's side and on my mother's side were men of faith. And that has been passed down through the generations, and I have inherited the blessing of that. And I have trust I have passed it on, or am passing it on to my children and my grandchildren. When you and I become a Christian and God begins to heal our personal lives, we may never experience the full effect of that healing in our lifetime, but our children will and our grandchildren will. That is what the psalmist is saying here. Notice how he puts it. May your deeds be shown to your servants. That's his own generation, including himself. And then your splendor to their children. That's the legacy of family. And you also want to feel that your work is significant. That is another kind of legacy. Psalm 90 verse 17 says, may the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. I guess that all of us want to leave our workplace in a better situation than when we entered it. But can I suggest in this era when retirement is becoming a very fluid notion, that any work we do, whether it's in a paid capacity or in a voluntary capacity, it's significant. And I love this quote from a book by Tom Wright. The book's entitled Surprised by Hope, Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church. And it was published in 2008. And Tom Wright says this, what you do in the present, by painting, preaching, singing, sewing, praying, teaching, building hospitals, digging wells, campaigning for justice, writing poems, caring for the needy, loving your neighbor as yourself will last into God's future. These activities are not simply ways of making the present life a little less beastly, a little more bearable until the day when we leave it behind altogether. They're part of what we may call building for God's kingdom. And so Tom Wright is suggesting that the good things that you and I do in this life, in our work, whether that's unpaid work or paid work, whatever we do that is good and positive and affirming and helping others, helping our society, carries over into the life beyond. And we'll all enjoy that on a new in heaven that will be a renewed earth. Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. How do we do this? We do it through doing a reality check, one that embraces the realities of death, of God, and of life, and we engage with life through counting our blessings, embracing both laughter and legacy. Earlier on, I highlighted that this psalm, written by Moses, sadly states that for all of us, life is brief and has grief. But can I suggest when you and I trust in God, we find true and eternal relief. Let me close with a song I sung as a teenager. Life at best is very brief, like the falling of a leaf, like the binding of a sheaf. Be in time. Fleeting days are telling fast that the die will soon be cast, and the fatal line be past. Be in time. Be in time. Be in time. While the voice of Jesus calls you, be in time. If in sin you longer wait, you may find no open gate, and your cry be just too late. Be in time. May God bless you, and may you truly know God's blessing in the rest, every day of the rest of your life. Amen.